The Radical Secular Podcast, a demand for justice, equality, and rational public policy. Subscribe at YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and all the major podcast channels. Visit our website at theradicalsecular.com for articles, insights, and our complete library of episodes. Support us on Patreon, and follow us on social media.
Hello, and welcome to the Radical Secular Podcast. I'm Sean Prophet.
And I'm Joe Kipinti.
We've got a very sobering show for you today. This has been a very, very bad moment for secularism, with that bombshell of a leaked draft of the Supreme Court opinion overturning Roe v. Wade. The leak happened 2 weeks ago, and that's one of the disadvantages for us, is that when news like this breaks, we have to wait a long while to talk to you about it. And boy, have I been ragey these past 2 weeks. So yeah. I can't wait to get started. We're also going to discuss the latest Florida insanity, as if banning books and the critical race theory psyop and the Don't Say Gay law weren't enough. Florida has also rejected a number of math textbooks and has found a new villain, social emotional learning. Governor Ron DeSantis last week also signed a new law mandating instruction about victims of communism. Joe and I will also be briefly touching on our usual hobby horses, climate, COVID, and Ukraine. Later, we'll be talking to our special guest, Kevin Bolling, who is the executive director of the Secular Student Alliance. So stay tuned for that interview. But first, I want to remind you that if you like our show, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, check out our Patreon page, and tell your friends to listen. New episodes post Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. We also publish new articles regularly in our journal at theradicalsecular.com.
The Radical Secular Podcast is brought to you by Cannibal & Co., located in downtown Jersey City and at shopcannibal.com. Cannibal, that's Cannibal with a K, stocks a rotating collection of goods ranging from apparel and accessories to home furnishings and fine jewelry. Cannibal weaves together its forward-thinking vision with its traditional roots to provide an expertly curated experience of unique and locally sourced finds. We're grateful to Cannibal for sponsoring our show.
All right, well, we're going to hold off today and do our T-shirts during the guest segment. So let's jump right in. Joe, why don't you start? Let's talk about Roe v. Wade.
Well, so I agree with you. This has been heartrending, I should say. And it's not unexpected. We've talked about this, you and I, and with Christoph and others. I mean, for years and years, we talked about this during the 2016 election, until there was nothing left to talk about. I mean, over and over again. I am a very progressive person, especially in terms of climate, economics, and that kind of thing. But I was pushing 100% for Hillary because I knew not only was she going to be 1,000 times better on the issues that I cared about, but in particular about this issue and other cultural issues like this, when we have this assault on human rights that's been building over the last few decades, she was going to be someone that could stand up to it and that could be a source of strength for the rest of us. And and that was denied. It was denied by really foolish and unthinking anger towards and people buying into the propaganda against her. I mean, and ultimately now we're reaping the fruits of that, just bad thinking at the time.
I can't even tell you. I mean, we did a show on this. I think it was like our 10th show or something like that, called Trolley Problem Voting. And, this whole thing, every election, every decision that gets made, everything in public policy is always a trade-off, right? Nothing ever happens in the political world or even a personal world. You have to make choices. You have to make trade-offs. You don't always get what you want. You get what you need, as the song says. And in this case, we needed Hillary Clinton. We needed Hillary Clinton like we've never needed anyone before in our nation's history. She was the most qualified nominee to ever run for president, in terms of her actual qualifications. And
that's true. She was incredibly qualified.
Yeah, and she was somebody who would have handled Russia, who would have handled COVID, who would have handled all of these things. I mean, we have paid such an incredible price for that, and now we're about to pay an even worse price. And this is like all of this was flashing before my eyes. I'm sure it was flashing before your eyes, Joe, when on November 9th, 2016, and in the months leading up to it, I wrote hundreds of essays and Facebook posts and everything else like that, and I could not get through. I could not break through, this idea that there was something fundamentally corrupt and wrong about Hillary. The giant meteor, all of these things were just psyops to sort of poison. Like if you were a lefty, Hillary Clinton was kind of a conservative and kind of a war hawk and kind of, she spoke at Goldman Sachs and, this, that, and the other thing, all these criticisms. And you had people, everybody from Cornel West to Susan Sarandon to Robert Reich to, all these people. And then Bernie Sanders and all of his people were just, rabid and vicious toward Hillary Clinton. Now, I know that a lot of Bernie supporters were saying things like, well, yes, he conceded and he did ultimately back her, but it's that hesitation that happened. And then the Comey emails and then, her getting sick at 9/11 and like all these things that happened. It was just one death by 1,000 cuts. And one of those cuts was misogyny, frankly. It was just, it was misogyny. Absolutely. So I could go on about this. I've said all this and I'm heartsick over it because of what I know this is going to mean.
Well, and she lost by a hair's breadth too. Wisconsin was like, 10,000, 20,000 votes or something crazy like that. Yeah,
it was 60,000 overall.
It was a super close election. So even the slightest nudge would have done it. And I do know a lot of progressives, really hard progressives that did end up voting for her, but not supporting on the way was damaging.
Well, this is the point, because even if somebody ended up voting for her, that person would have had 30 or 50 Facebook posts talking about how she was corrupt and a warmonger and all these other things like that, right? And they had their ducks in a row. And this was a psyop basically that was it was started in 2015. There's an article in the New York Times basically saying right baits the left to turn against Hillary Clinton. So the entire battle plan was laid out in advance for this whole thing. And you can it's not just for, all the normal things the right is for, which is tax cuts and fossil fuels and repression of rights, but it was also Roe v. Wade. What part of that did people not understand in 2016?
They denied it. They didn't want to accept just how ruthless this alt-right religious movement is and what they really want. They want really, truly extreme radical change for this country.
It seems like they're going to get it.
Well, and here's, again, I'm one of those people DeSantis is warning about teaching communism, right? I'm a real hardcore progressive. And I understood that I had to be 100% behind Hillary. I don't understand why so many people couldn't see that, unfortunately. But anyway, we should look to the present now and think about what we can do and lay out the landscape right now. Maybe that's one thing we can work towards. Well, I don't know.
Right. But the problem is, and the reason why it's worth kind of delving back and doing figuring out whose fault it is, because look, we, the left, did this. Okay. We, the right, ultimately, they told us what they were going to do, and we fell right into their trap. And so it's important for us to take responsibility. That's not going to help women and girls. It's not going to help the women and girls who need abortions. It's not going to help all of the carnage that we're going to see as a result of this. Okay. But it might maybe help us next time there's a choice. Next time you're considering about, voting for somebody you'd like to have a beer with, or voting personality, right? Instead of policy. That's a big part of what happened here, was that we learned a hard lesson, or we need to learn a hard lesson as the left, that you vote policy, you vote party, because that's what the Republicans have been doing. That's what got them here. That's what got them a 6-3 conservative majority on the court, is they vote in lockstep. There is no questioning. There's no sniping. There's a little bit of this rhino business, but it's not a tenth of what happens on the left.
So I think it was legitimate for people who supported Bernie Sanders to support Bernie Sanders during the primary.
Yes.
Without destroying Hillary, but they could have been, they could have been rationally critical about her positions. But after the primary, it was Hillary versus Trump, Donald Trump, that person. And look what he's done. I mean, this man pulled us out of the Paris Agreement. He destroyed all kinds of long-standing relationships with our allies. He did so much damage. The tax cuts. I mean, it was just, how can you justify all that because you're just angry?
You can't. And he blew COVID also, which, cost a million Americans.
People.
1 million Americans are dead because of this, and potentially half to 2/3 of them were unnecessary deaths if they had been handled according to the pandemic playbook that was left by the Obama administration for Trump specifically for this purpose. Okay. And they tore it up and they didn't use it.
They purposely tore it up. I mean, it wasn't just incidental, like, we forgot about it. They tore it up.
Yeah. And by the way, I want to say one more thing before we get off the subject of the 2016 election. Yeah. Quit fucking saying the phrase corporate Democrats. Quit saying that, okay? Quit fucking saying corporate Democrats. If you say corporate Democrats, you're responsible for all of what has now happened, okay? And you're going to be responsible for the next level of fascism and tyranny that has happened, okay? We don't move forward as a country unless the entire center of the Democratic Party moves forward, okay? And we've got somebody like Joe Manchin, who is a Democrat in a red state. Without Joe Manchin, as much as we all love to hate on him, okay, without Joe Manchin, we don't control the gavel in the Senate, okay? We wouldn't have even gotten any of the things passed through the Senate that Joe Biden has gotten passed. So whenever you use the phrase corporate Democrats, now I am no friend of Joe Manchin, and I'm also very angry at Kyrsten Sinema. Okay, these two, but I would not use that phrase corporate Democrats. They have just basically betrayed the party. Okay, and that's enough to say. But there's a lot of other accusations that would be, people on the left who are Bernie supporters would label like half of the Democratic caucus as corporate Democrats because they don't support X, Y, or Z policy. And I think this is a lesson that we have to learn once and for all. Stop using corporate Democrats, okay? We are all Democrats.
Yes, and absolutely, I agree with you 100%. And the larger lesson is strategy. You can have policy differences, you can have philosophical differences, but politics is the art of the possible. And we have to be realistic about what's possible. Yes, you want a revolution, wonderful. You want a revolution. But right now, where the rubber meets the road is human rights, climate change, like all of these things that are existentially important that you can't just throw under the bus because of your ideology. Okay.
Right.
I mean,
I love AOC. I love the squad. Okay. I love these guys. They're, even Bernie Sanders. I voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary in 2020. Okay. Like I am as left as you, Joe, if not more so. We're right in there. We are comrades in this. Okay. But, these policies are not getting implemented. And even if they did get implemented, they won't pass the Supreme Court. Like we really, really screwed ourselves on this. And this lesson has to be learned if we're ever going to claw back anything that we expected, like from the 1960s forward in terms of expanding human rights. We have got to hold together as a party and stop demonizing people who are trying to get elected in the middle of this country. And, and who maybe, and who maybe, some of these people may be taking money from big corporations. Yeah, they are, because that's the way our system works now, is you have to take money to get elected. Have to. And so if we want our policies to have any chance at all, we have got to stick to the center of the Democratic Party. And that's all I got to say about that.
Yeah. It's a good post-mortem. We have to be strategic. We really do. And we have to be pragmatic about what's possible. You can have the long view. If you want to get rid of capitalism, look, I think there's a lot of problems with capitalism. I think we can talk about that until the cows come home. Whatever your ultimate goal is, go for it, but also be strategic. Right? Look at the moment, understand the suffering that will happen if you do this or that. Right? Yeah. You can say, I'm not going to, anyway, let's go ahead and move on.
Well, I mean, it's like, I think it was important to focus on that. We were going to talk, a little bit more about COVID and climate and Ukraine. I think we can skip that for now because this is really the thing that's happening the central thing that's happening in our country is that we have just lost an extremely important human right for half the population, and it'll probably get worse because of the rule.
Yeah. Well, it will get worse because this isn't just one right. This is, it all fits together. These rights, they support each other, right? And when one goes down, when the major one goes down, all the others are weaker and they're more fragile now because of that. This is bad news. It's bad news in every sense, shape, and form we can think of. I mean, in terms of my issue, right? Green New Deal and a sane energy policy and all that. The Supreme Court is going to stand in the way of that as well.
They very well might. And we actually may come to the point where we recognize, I hope this is not true, but we may come to the point to recognize the 2016 election as having been more consequential in American history than the Civil War, and in the opposite direction. And so I think that's true, because I honestly believe that we are really unraveling as a society, as a nation, in almost every level. If you look at it, even if you got rid of climate change, let's say take that out of the equation, right? And just look at what we're doing with energy policy. When we have a finite resource, it's getting harder and harder to procure, right? The cost of procuring oil, let's say, is far, far greater than ever was before. Back 100 years ago, you wanted 100 barrels of, you wanted 100 barrels of oil. All you have to do is put in 1 barrel worth of effort to get 100 barrels, right? Because it was just, you just dug a hole and it was squared out and you just tapped it. Now, if you factor in everything, including costs of transportation, extraction, turning it into gasoline and all that, it's like 4 to 1. It goes from 100 to 1, 4 to 1. So at a certain point, it's becoming so unviable as a resource. Even if you factor away environment, pollution, the 11 million people that die from fossil fuel pollution every year, climate change, it is not. We have to transition away from that resource as expediently as possible for a whole bunch of reasons, and we're just not doing it. We're not doing it. Well, and I read a really alarming article this week that didn't seem to get a whole lot of mention, but people should be thinking about this. And that is, we have an environment right now where, we got an embargo going on with Russia. We got some oil off the world market, but OPEC is actually not pumping as much as they agreed to pump. And they're not pumping
there's all kinds of weirdness happening with that.
They're not pumping it because, this is record prices, right? We've got like almost record prices, and they're still not pumping more oil because they can't. And it's a combination of declining resources, right? And also declining investment. And so this is something that, I was on this sort of peak oil, we're running out of oil thing back around 2005 when everybody else was too. And it turned out not to be true because we've been using a lot of enhanced oil recovery methods. But like you're talking about,
cracking.
Joe, and tar sands and shale and all that. And the thing is that the energy returned on energy invested, which is what you're talking about, has dropped from like you said, 100 to 1 to maybe 4, maybe even less than 4 to 1.
For tar sands, it's like 1.4 to 1.
Yeah.
It's just ridiculous.
This is really, and so we should have done all of this. We should have dealt with this climate and resource issues, back in the 90s when we had the chance. We knew about it, and oil was cheap. It was still plentiful. And again, another consequential election, Al Gore coming in 2000 or George W. Bush, who took us more towards oil again. So this is a long-term issue. All of us have been talking about it for most of our lives. All of us have been concerned about it. But here we are. So I just go ahead, Joe.
Yeah. Well, and also, if you look at oil, the correlation, the relationship between energy and economic growth, the coefficient is almost 1 to 1. It's just, they go hand in hand. So if we start running out of energy, if we don't have enough energy supply, that is going to mean it's going to hit the economy hard, really hard.
Because oil is food. You're eating oil. Whenever you eat food that's been shipped in from anywhere, you're eating oil on your plate. Like, that's what it is.
Everything, you can't underestimate how important oil has been to the modern world. It underlies everything. And because everything needs energy. right? Food production in particular, but everything does. And so we need that energy. I mean, we can do some with efficiency, but not nearly as much as you think. Like, we've gotten more efficient in this country because we exported our industry, which is very inefficient, the hard industries. And so we've gotten a lot more efficient, but it wasn't because we all of a sudden had these incredible energy innovations. I mean, yeah, some, but we have screwed ourselves.
Ultimately, we have to transition to renewable energy, but guess what? That takes oil as well. So even the transition takes oil and time. And so it's like anyway, 2016,
forever,
making this very difficult. So, but I want to talk about, I just want to take a brief detour now, because our guest today concerns is, he's the head of the Secular Student Alliance. And I want to talk about something that's going on with students, which is Florida. And, this whole thing is it's another part of the Republican plan, and it's diabolical. It's diabolical. And you're an educator, Joe. I mean, talk to us about this. And it's not just been one thing. It's been about 5 things coming out of Florida.
Yeah. Remember the first time, like several years ago, they were after anthropology for a while. They wanted to get rid of all the anthropology in Florida. That was DeSantis, I think. Because why? What was threatening about anthropology? Right? The study of humankind. It challenges a lot of their belief systems directly. Right? And so that's what they're after. They really are closing every single ideological avenue except for theirs. That's what they want. They want everyone to focus on this Christian nationalism, this white Christian nationalism, as they have defined it. And anything that's a threat to that, they are going to go after. And that's what they've been doing. And what happens is, I think, with education, like I said earlier, education is very secular. Especially higher ed, and especially in public schools, incredibly secular. We go out of our way to be secular, right? And that's a tradition that goes back a long, long time. So the whole educational structure is a direct threat to theocracy. And that's what they're after.
Well, and if you start to look at what they're doing, first they start out and they go, oh, you're teaching pornography to children, right? Like, that's their whole thing, the sex ed. But then it goes worse than that. Oh, you're teaching critical race theory, right? And then so you can't teach history now. Okay. And it goes even beyond that to now the concepts that they're dumbing down just keep getting lower and lower and lower. And there's some of them are so innocuous that you just can't figure out what the hell they're even talking about. And I want to read an excerpt on social emotional learning to kick us off. It's from The Cut, and it's by Claire Lampin. So here we go. Across the country, conservatives are increasingly mounting resistance to social emotional learning, or SEL, as a sort of extension of their critical race theory paranoia. Why is that? Time to unpack. What is social emotional learning? In short, social emotional education helps children develop emotional literacy when it comes to their own feelings or other people's. The goal of these programs is to build empathy and to help kids self-regulate, enhance sensitivity in interpersonal interactions, and communicate. The Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, CASEL, a pioneering organization in the field, highlights 5 fundamental principles that teachers can use to guide kids to practice in the classroom and ideally carry into their communities. They are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making, all of which feels fairly straightforward and hard to argue with. The encouragement of emotional processing seems valuable to crucial if the goal is to avoid raising a generation of little sociopaths. According to I think the Republicans want little sociopaths, frankly. According to the Washington Post, SEL programs aimed at fostering respect, kindness, and honesty, etc., have been standard in many K-12 schools for decades, particularly during the pandemic. Schools have leaned on SEL curricula to help students manage their mental health. But even before that, districts across the country were implementing SEL to combat rising suicide rates among teens. As NBC notes, some parents criticize those programs for fixating on suicide when realistically the goal is prevention and teaching kids how to recognize depression. Those pushing back against SEL often seem to have it backward, but their complaints line up with a right-wing worldview. And the right is opposed to SEL because Over the past few months, certain conservatives have zeroed in on SEL as another Trojan horse for progressive ideology, the latest child indoctrination scheme, as the self-appointed Child Protection League puts it. Their names of their stuff are just always so like Orwellian. Anyway, per the Post. For context, the Child Protection League describes itself as a group that, among other things, encourages children to freely express their political beliefs, moral standards, and faith in schools and experience personal, physical privacy and modesty in bathrooms, showers, locker rooms, and living spaces separated by biological sex. If that gives you a sense of where this is going, it seems a segment of the right fears that encouraging children toward consideration and compassion for their peers will lead to acceptance of their differences, whether in race or gender or sexuality or religion or any number of other identity-based areas of life. End of quote. Now, I mean, like, this is just, you couldn't distill a more clear conflict between secularism and acceptance versus conservatism, right, and religious, bigotry. So, right. But I don't understand how it's hard for me to understand how a right winger could object to. Let me go back and read these things again. It is self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision making. Doesn't that seem like it? What would be the problem with that, right? It's just, go ahead.
It goes back to something you talk about a lot, Sean, and that's hierarchy. So the religious worldview, and especially the alt-right worldview, is about rigid hierarchy. And social and emotional learning actually challenges that directly, because if people are self-aware, if people are respectful of others, if people are empathic, if people understand their responsibilities and try to, all those things mean questioning authority when authority is wrong. And I think that the hierarchical worldview finds all that very threatening, because ultimately what it means is enlightened individuals, like more enlightened anyway, right? Awakened individuals. The whole woke thing, that's been characterized and caricatured and all that. But really what it means to awaken is to become aware of who you are, what the world is, other people around you. And that's all about social and emotional learning, all of it.
Yeah, it is. Well, I think it's a really great curriculum, and the opposition to it really reminds me of another right-wing psyop in the late 1960s and early 70s that I was hearing about when I was in my dad was, he's this arch conservative. He belonged to the John Birch Society, which was, as we know, started by the Koch brothers. And, he was just livid that I was being indoctrinated in public school. I was hearing this exact same language. It's like word for word, except instead of social emotional learning, it was called sensitivity training. And his big boogeyman was that, they're going to teach you sensitivity training. I didn't even know what it was. I had no idea what that even meant. But, I don't know why the hell my dad, who was, theoretically a moral man and who had a sense of right and wrong, would be opposed to kids learning to be sensitive to the feelings of others. We know the usual reasons, that they think it's going to make people into snowflakes or soft or effeminate. I just wonder, I still can't figure this out. And I know that what you said just now about hierarchy is right, but I feel like I'm missing something else. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't explain it at all. I don't ultimately, as a human being, as a father, as a friend, as, a lover, as, a teacher, I don't understand it at all. It's crushing to people who would think this way and be so threatened by having people who are emotionally mature. Why is that? Because ultimately it would make for such a better world if we did, nurture that. Right? If we nurture that, the more we nurture that, the better the world becomes. And why they don't want that, I think in part, it is the hierarchy. I think, this kowtowing to authority from God to your boss, all the way to all the way on down.
Loyalty
is an essential part. Yeah.
Loyalty despite your feelings. Being willing, even going to war, being willing to kill another human being, for your country. Right. Like, all of these things involve inverting empathy and destroying empathy.
We are democracy, but in the books and in some ways in real life, we still have some democratic principles. People say we don't have democracy anymore. Yeah, we still are to some extent, but every single corporation is a fiefdom, right? Top down. Right?
They are. That's true. Especially when you say that a state is an at-will employment state, that means you could be fired at will. That means it's a dictatorship, right? There's no recourse. Yeah. I mean, and unless, sometimes there is now, you've got HR departments, you've got EEOC, you can file a complaint or arbitration or a grievance if you have a union. So there are ways to mitigate that fiefdom in that corporation, but.
Yeah, I mean, and so now you're head of a corporation, and you can still get screwed by somebody, accusing you of sexual harassment, right?
Yeah.
Social emotional learning is responsible for that. That's what they think, in a way. Whether they are consciously aware of it or not, that's what's causing it. They don't want people to be socially, emotionally aware. They want people to kowtow to authority, and they don't want to be questioned. That's what's going on, I think.
Yeah, well, and speaking of which, I have one more thing I want to go through before our guest segment, and that is this incident that happened with the Don't Say Gay law and this high school class president. Okay. Now, Don't Say Gay is supposed to be a law that preventing discussion of sexuality in 1st through 3rd grade. So you might think, oh, well, they shouldn't be probably talking about sex in 1st through 3rd grade. That's okay. But in practice, the law is being used and expanded way beyond that. It's having a chilling effect on all of school subjects and all of school, anyone LGBTQ who is in school is again being turned into second class citizen. And there was just a story from Florida a couple days ago. This kid, his name is Xander Moritz, and he was graduating from high school, but they threatened to cut his microphone off if he referred to his sexuality at all in his graduation speech. Now, this is a guy, he's an activist. He's been an activist his entire student career, and he's been very popular and elected class president. And he is not allowed to speak freely at his own graduation. And this is from the same people who are now, suing social media companies to make sure that they don't censor anyone, but they want to censor people whenever and wherever they can. So it just, I don't know. The whole thing is just, it's again, the bottomless pit of bad faith, the terrible hypocrisy. Yeah. They don't care about the First Amendment except when it applies, to the way they like it. And it gives schools a really easy way to suppress the identity of any gay student, making them feel like second-class citizen.
And even for the 1st to 3rd graders, how many of them actually have gay parents? They're not supposed to exist. You can't talk about your parents. I mean, come on. And even if everything you said, which is actually right, wasn't the case, that alone, what are you doing? You're shaming these children. You're making them ashamed of their parents. Yeah. Another one of those, a characteristic that belongs in a hierarchical order, right? Shame. Right. And it just.
Yeah. What happens when a kid is, like in art class or drawing in class or whatever it is, and they draw a picture of themselves holding the hands, and there's 2 guys in suits, with ties. Like you can imagine a gay child who had 2 fathers would draw something like this. Is that kid going to get sent to the principal's office now for having drawn a picture? And what if another kid comes over and says, ooh, you have 2 daddies, right? And then the kid says, yes, I do. And so now this has been brought up in the class by the children. Is that teacher supposed to, these kids are going to get suspended? I mean, what's going to happen here? It doesn't make any sense.
It's all just a tension, right? The kids pick up on tension. And this is going to create a lot of tension. Even if not a lot is said, even if the teacher is well-meaning and wants to talk about it and can't, that tension's going to be there, right? So the kids are going to know, they're going to associate that negativity with their relationship with their parents. I mean, and ultimately what all of this is trying to make people disappear, right? Disappear.
Erasure.
People. Erasure. I mean, talk about, cancel culture. This is like cancel culture multiplied 1,000 times, right? In terms of its destructiveness. It's official.
It's being done by the state. So it's, and here's the other thing where the state is getting involved in education in a really weird way, which we mentioned in the intro, and that is this Victims of Communism bill. And there's actually a bill that requires, this is signed by the governor of a state, requiring the schools in the state to teach about victims of communism. And they have to spend a certain amount of time every year talking about how communism hurt people. And look, okay, it's totalitarianism. It's not communism, right? Like communism is an economic system.
The result that,
we just it's the whole thing. It's such it's like another Red Scare playing out all over again.
Well, they don't want to talk about social emotional learning. They just want to scare people about communism.
Yeah. I mean, think about that. Think about how far we've fallen from a place where we had teachers who were progressive and who were supported by national organizations and had the support of their government to help kids learn and grow and build a more inclusive society. And now we have the exact opposite of that in many, many states.
Yeah. What else can you say? I mean, we need to take this seriously and do what we can and we're going to have a guest on that's going to talk about some strategies. I think that would be great to hear what he's doing and like what his organization is doing. So maybe something we can concretely focus on and start to do some activism. We all need to. All of us.
All right. Well, let's go then and introduce our guest, Kevin Bolling. He is the executive director of the Secular Student Alliance with over 20 years of nonprofit leadership experience. Kevin's career has included 15 years of student association management and on-campus program development from Los Angeles to Boston. For 10 years, Kevin served as the executive director of the California Thoroughbred Horsemen's Foundation, a charitable trust serving the healthcare needs of the industry's largely immigrant workforce. Most recently, Kevin served as the director of philanthropy at the Gay Men's Chorus of Los Angeles, a major LGBTQ arts advocacy organization whose youth outreach work has moved thousands of hearts and minds across the U.S. toward embracing LGBTQ equality. Without further delay, The Radical Secular presents Kevin Bolling. Hi, Kevin. Thanks for being with us and welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you today.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's kick off and do our T-shirts. Kevin, do you have a T-shirt to talk about today?
Well, I did. This is, if I can, this is our recent edition. So every year with the Secular Student Alliance, we do a sort of lifestyle shirt. And so this was our one this year. And so it's humankind and it says be both. So just a fun little one and just a nice, good positive message, I think, especially over the last few years.
Yeah, nice play on words there.
Yeah. I was going to wear a similar shirt, my humanist shirt, but I decided to wear this one instead, Green New Deal. What's the deal with that? Whatever happened? Like we were all talking about that a few years ago. No, it's just like we have so many.
It just evaporated.
Well, I mean, there's so many other like powerful things in front of us that we're looking at, right? So I wanted just to remind people, right, that we need to shift in that direction.
For sure. Well, my shirt today is, I couldn't really, I didn't have anything really topical about this, so I wore my Star Trek shirt.
Awesome.
Well, that's fun.
And the reason I wore the Star Trek shirt is because we talk about this a lot on the show, Kevin. Whenever things get dire and difficult for us, we always kind of retreat into, the Star Trek world. And, it shouldn't have to be a retreat because we should be building this world, or at least moving toward it, doing some of the things that would get us there. And instead we seem to be doing the exact opposite of that.
Yeah, devolving back to the 1950s.
Yeah, or even beyond.
You're true.
Okay, well, let's get into it. Kevin, first, I'd like you to talk about your organization and the kind of work you do for secular students. I was listening to another interview that you did recently on Secular Left, and we're a friend of that show. So, but I heard you mention some particular challenges for your organization having to do with COVID. So you just talk generally and then about how the pandemic was for you.
Sure, happy to. So yeah, the Secular Student Alliance is a national nonprofit organization. And so while we're a nonprofit, the real emphasis of the organization and our purpose is really to support students in college universities, high schools, and middle schools all over the country. And so the vast majority of our students have chapters at their schools or at their colleges and do a variety of programming, build community on their campus, a foundation for activism and secular activism. And so that's really the heart of our organization. And the national office is here simply to support all the students, provide lots and lots of free resources so they can be out and public and active on their campuses or at their schools, and then really just to support them in what they're doing. COVID has been interesting for everybody, and I think for a nonprofit sort of geared towards students, and just how quickly in March of 20, just one day everyone was at school and the next everyone was going home. It was a really interesting process, and I think there's obviously lots of religious students on campus and lots of non-religious students on campus, but the majority of our students, through surveying, come from religious families. So when religious students went home to their religious families and their religious communities, they were fine. They had a similar support. When our students left sort of all of their secular friends and doing their programming and being involved, they oftentimes went home to religious families and religious communities.
Yeah.
And so really lost a big part of that support. So, I mean, literally within a week, we completely transitioned everything we were doing programmatically. And so started individually mailing students and, of course, doing just a huge variety of virtual programming just to make sure that the students had contact and relationships and still community with other non-religious or secular students. And it was, obviously educational stuff, but games and social stuff and hangouts and all those sort of things that they had at their campuses that they didn't have at home anymore.
I see.
Oh, that sounds really great.
Yeah.
Sounds really good.
Kevin, I want to say before we start, I really admire what you do. I think it's awesome. I think you should get a medal. I've done a little bit of it. I'm an educator, and I was an arts council vice president for a while, and I worked with LGBTQ plus communities, and I've done a little bit of what you do, and I think it's so important what you're doing. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I enjoy doing it. And to me, really working with the students and really we're fostering leadership development and building community just in multiple different places. So that's really the heart of what we do. And when we do our scholarship applications, seeing what the students are involved in, because it's activism related, I'm just floored about the number and the amount of stuff that our students are doing just out there every single day. It's just fantastic.
Awesome. Yeah.
It gives me hope.
Yeah.
Actually, to think about it.
Definitely.
And we sorely need that.
We do. I mean, we get, this, it's been a rough couple of weeks here. Yeah. But I want to talk specifically. It's no secret that Republicans have been making huge inroads into sabotaging secular education for kids, particularly in charter schools. But now, even in public schools in places like Florida, and really it's going on all over the country, and this assault on school boards and teachers that's coming out of churches. And it's really anyone who doesn't teach straight up white supremacist Christian dogma. I have a friend who lives in Thousand Oaks, California, and he is just he's at ground zero of all of this. And he was just telling me about how there's all this outside money coming in from other states, from Republican national organizations into some of the churches there, and that they literally took over the school board, and it took them all that they could do just to get reasonable, rational people back on the school board, and this is probably something that is going on in thousands of little communities around the nation. And so I wanted to ask you about how your organization is dealing with this challenge. What do you see as the major pitfalls and opportunities of this political moment in terms of secular education?
Sure. And I think that it's important to recognize that the Republicans and conservative Christians sort of joined forces a while ago and really looked at how they could get into local school boards and sort of take over the curriculum. And this is years and years and years they've been working on this, about loading the courts with Project Blitz and the intentional plan and, copycats, bills and initiatives that could be placed into schools all over the country. So this has been a long time coming, and for all intents and purposes, well organized in its sort of implementation, and it's been a long game. So this isn't something that I think now is going to happen overnight. Fortunately, I think there are lots of strong foundations in our public education that sort of buttress a little bit about what the Republicans and current conservative Christians are currently doing. But I think, there's some, when we look especially Florida and Texas at the moment, and the copycat stuff coming in Missouri and Ohio, I mean, it's a little unnerving. But I do think we have when I look at the upcoming population of young people, so, we're almost at 50% of young people are identifying as non-religious. And with that come, or the abandonment of a lot of the dogma of religion, and especially that conservative religion that we're seeing. I think the current Supreme Court focus on, obviously their move to undo Roe when you consider the number of young people who support reproductive health and the right to abortion, the long-term game is all of the young people now, and that's talking about being hopeful, aren't going to stand for this. So the things that we're seeing against LGBT, especially against trans kids, what we're seeing, against women, as far as especially with choice, environmental issues, which Green New Deal, young people are super active and aren't going to be putting up with this. And as they become more and more politically active and stronger vote, and we know about 85% of our students are registered to vote, we're going to see those changes. Unfortunately, we have to now wait the long game, I think, for that to change.
Yeah, it could be a very long time. I mean, with the Supreme Court, and that's the problem. I just hope that all these young people who are so on fire and so enthusiastic, and they want equality, they want secularism, I hope they don't get slapped down so hard that they enter into that learned helplessness. That's my fear, because that's what happens when you've got entrenched forces that keep people down. They try, they organize, but nothing changes, right? And so that makes them cynical and give up and all. So I really hope that doesn't happen here.
Well, I have to say, having worked in higher education, as public higher education primarily, I've been very privileged with working in a very secular environment. Like public higher education is really one of the key secular institutions of our society. And we are maintaining that as much as we can. There is still a strong tradition of secularism in public higher education. And so we are there to really work with students and present a non-biased secular view on all the issues. We are. And so that's still something let's not forget that, right? We still have some really solid institutions in our society that are on the right side of things. And we just have to, the main thing I think is the assault we're seeing in secondary schools and primary schools, where these religious, indoctrination efforts are something we need to absolutely focus on. But I do think, Kevin, that you're right. I do see the same thing in my students at the higher ed level. I see a lot more secularism, a lot more suspicion of religious dogma, and an openness to different ideas, more so than ever, really. So that's a good sign.
All right. Well, Kevin, I want to delve a bit into a topic that comes up for us a lot, and that is the important differences between atheism and secularism, because they're kind of two separate movements in a way. And in the minds of a lot of Christians who are satisfied, they'll never be happy with anything less than total Christian dominance in all areas of life, which is their, 7 mountains strategy, which I'm sure you're aware of. Secularism to them might as well be atheism, but to us, we see important differences. What are those differences and parallels as you see them, and how do we work all of that to our advantage politically?
And I think in looking at our population, we work with young people. I think we sort of parse words a little bit, which it is important to do. But for many young people, they identify with many different labels. And so they're not solely an atheist. They're not solely a humanist. They're not solely secular. They go, yeah, there are bits and portions of my life which interact and identify with and how I live my life. And so I think the simple view of atheists is I don't believe in gods or God or gods. And I think I have very good friends in American atheists that say that's not it. I go, it's true. But we'll get down to the simplistics of it. And clearly American Atheists is a great organization, and social justice and what they're doing legally in states is fantastic. So, and then sort of more the humanistic is those values. And, I believe that we should be making the world a humane place, and we should use rational decision making and how we do that. Secular, I think, is, it's very much for me is very much the separation of church and state. And we appeal to religious people as well. Like, you can be secular and be religious. If you and there are there's Christians against Christian nationalism, which is great to see, and are active in those sorts of things. We choose the word secular just because we feel it's one of the more inclusive terms. So sort of wherever you are in that scale, we probably all agree, the separation of church and state and our country was founded as a secular nation. So it's probably something that we could all agree on. And then you may have variations of how you believe and how you want to live out your life or how you identify.
Well, I mean, for religious minorities, secularism is absolutely critical, right? Secularism helps religious freedom more than anything else does in a lot of ways. So
you can't have religious freedom without secularism, because otherwise the dominant religion just takes over.
Yeah,
definitely. And a lot of our students on campuses actually work with Muslim students and Hindu students, so students of minority religions, quote unquote, and LGBT students, because they are often in the same sphere and pressures from sort of the majority Christian presence, whether there's majority Christian or not, that definite feel for that and the attention that they get, and really, a lot of the privilege that they have on campuses.
Yeah, for sure. And this brings up my next point about this, which, is that all of us on this show, including our co-host, Christoph Defoe, who couldn't be here this week, we tend very much to the left end of the political spectrum. And it's really our wheelhouse and what we mean when we say justice, equality, and rational public policy. We mean social justice, and we mean breaking down all aspects of the conservative moral hierarchy on race and gender and nationality and religion and sexual orientation. I mean, we go after also the excesses of extreme wealth, and we push for economic justice, because you can't have, it all goes together, right? So we think that any proper reading of secularism means not being just insistent on equality for all religions, but equality for all people as
Absolutely.
well. And my question to you would be, is there room for conservatives in secularism, people who do not believe in equality? And if so, how do you reach out to them?
And I'll have to differentiate a little bit. So for the Secular Student Alliance, so we don't have a political ideology. And so we have surveyed our students, and we know that the vast majority of our students lean or are strongly progressive or left-leaning. But we do have conservative students who are members of the organization, and we want them to feel comfortable and have community and find a home and to live out their activism, whatever that may be. So I think there's very much for our organization, is their place? Yes. I do find it a little bit more difficult, personally, not professionally. I'll make the separation there, to work with non-religious people who may identify as conservative. It seems like the conservative values Trump, not, and pun unintended, Trump everything else. So, so I'm going to celebrate this Christian privilege and then discriminate against other religious students because it's, because they believe like I do politically, and leave out the whole part of secular and religious freedom and equality.
Yeah, well, it seems like it's really it may be a stepping stone, right? Because I was raised religious conservative, as many of us were, and it took me a while to come around. And one step along the way was, of course, libertarianism and atheism had a big part in that, because you don't get deprogrammed out of hard right conservatism overnight. And so it takes a little while, and sometimes you have to go through stages. But I just often wonder how people who, who don't believe in God and don't, how they could be against inclusion. It's just hard. It's hard for me to understand, because it seems like the religious impulse is the main thing that is driving discrimination, particularly against LGBT people.
Well, we've sort of looked at just, for our students and the different activism that they work in. We really look at, if you look at in the United States, so the, racial injustice, there's a strong sense of religious backing that all since the inception and all along. And even to where, at one point the Baptist Convention apologized for their sort of support of racial inequality, and the strong ties with, when you look at white supremacy and the Christian nationalism and white supremacy, just goes so perfectly together in our nation's history. The issues of women's equality and reproductive health. Clearly the ties there to the especially the conservative religious dogma, and LGBT, especially with trans kids right now, is obvious. And even I think even when you get into environmentalism and God created this planet so we could use and abuse it, and we have a better place to go after this. Well,
Yeah.
We really need to take on this one we've got right now.
Yeah,
Exactly. Well, and Joe and I talk about that all the time. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, the other thing is, I think that the religious right, what you folks are talking about here, is framing this fight against liberalism, right? They're framing it that way. They're saying we're anti-liberalism, we're anti-social justice. So they are the ones that it's their religious beliefs that are impinging upon the public space, the public sphere. That's exactly a case of separation of church and state. But it's also about culture as well, because we are a society, a multicultural society. And so we're extending our sense of being secular to that at a cultural level too, in the public space, in businesses and so forth. We do have some standards about human rights and human dignity that we demand are supported and adhered to. And that's also kind of our sense of what secularism means, because it really is impossible to disentangle those things.
I would agree.
Well, okay, let's move on a bit and talk about, earlier we talked about Roe v. Wade, and it's no secret that the GOP has been trying to overturn this decision for 50 years. They told us they were going to do it, and now they've done it. Barring some sort of last-minute change of heart, it looks like abortion is going to soon be illegal in at least half of American states, and possibly a national ban in a few years. They wasted no time to start talking about that. So, and this is leaving aside the larger implications for privacy and birth control and gay marriage and a whole lot of other things that we haven't even thought of, because we consider this to be, frankly, a disaster and a huge setback for secularism. How are you feeling? What will your organization do to support any students, who after this ban or whatever are still going to definitely need reproductive health care?
Well, definitely, our students are obviously advocates already when it comes to their access to abortion and women's reproductive health. So they are already active in these arenas and already doing things in their individual communities. So we obviously support that. And so as soon as the draft was leaked, we actually communicate with all of our students. If you're when are protests happening, getting involved with protests, sort of our stance to them about that. And we automatically came out and said, if you need a banner, and we came up with a couple different designs, like, just let us know, and this will be in the mail to you tomorrow, so that you have a big banner to walk behind when you're at those rallies and those protests. So we're super active with that. We said, if you have your own design, send it to us. We'll send you a banner, because we want our students to be active, but in whatever they're passionate about. And clearly, for all of our students, this is not their pressing issue, but I think all of our students, I said for the most part, understand the importance of this. And I think, as you sort of brought up, and Alito in his recent interview to explain or to touch on the leak, already has alluded to he doesn't like the same-sex marriage and those sorts of things, and those were not decisions he agreed with either. And then the opportunity to overturn those. So yeah, I think this is the start of what we're going to see from this court.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really going to be organizations like yours and who can maintain these networks of solidarity, because solidarity is really the only defense against this kind of onslaught. Right. Do you have something to say, Joe?
No, I'm just agreeing with you. Yeah, I mean, I do have a question for you, Kevin. I know if you don't mind me posing one now. I wonder, from you working with kids, what do you think? How are you perceiving their mental health? Are they feeling really threatened by this? Are they scared? Are they angry? Like, again, it's anywhere from reproductive rights to LGBTQ plus rights. These things really do matter to a lot of young people, and they are existential issues for them. And I'm just wondering, what's your sense of that?
I think this is on top of coming out of COVID. And so I think the mental health, the dramatic impact on young people's mental health during COVID, which I don't think we're going to understand the long-term ramifications of for a while. That on top, and we really experienced sort of coming out this what we call sort of COVID fatigue, coming back to campus, and just this this real sense of it was hard to re-engage, just for a variety of reasons. They wanted to, but it was just super difficult. And so we've sort of been working with that and really doing a lot to focus on that aspect. And I think this on top of it, I think students are pissed off, just in the larger sense. And again, I think the vast majority of students we know from polling and those things support access to abortion. And if 1 in 4 of women will have an abortion in their lifetime, and much more women are talking about it, and stigma about having an abortion is being reduced. They know people who have had abortions. They may have had abortion themselves, and so they understand the importance of this in continuing their education and allowing them to continue their goals and the plans that they have for life. And so those are all super important to them. But I think when you're young, you really feel that, especially at this time. And college is that I think a crucial time in their lives where this is extremely important.
Yeah, absolutely. And this dovetails kind of right with our next question, which is talking about second-class citizens, because that seems to be, and that's kind of a tagline for this show, because that seems to be the goal of Republicans, is to make everyone else into second-class citizens. They want Christians to be the only ones recognized as real Americans. They want straight, male. It's like it's all of this hierarchy stuff, and you got tiers. You got second, third, fourth, fifth class citizens. But either way, they are people who don't enjoy full human rights. And this has been said in the past about atheists, for sure, because there used to be actual laws on the books in many places to prevent us from holding public office. But I think that the real second-class citizens at the moment are women and children, especially after the loss of Roe v. Wade. And with this sort of furious assault on truthful education, as I say all the time, equality is our primary goal, and empathy is equally important. And this idea of second-class citizens just does violence to both of those concepts, and it just pisses me off. So are we just going to have to live with the fact that women and kids are being treated this way? Do you see this turning around? I kind of already asked you that, but I just how do we give people hope about this?
Yeah, I think that obviously, I think all have seen the maps now, the red states, where we know there's going to be 21 states, I think it is, where the trigger laws and laws will kick in to almost either limit abortion or completely limit access. But I do there's lots of programs I think that are coming into place, and I have lots of friends who are like, if you're in an area where you can't get an abortion, I will mail you medication. Mm-hmm. So I think we're gonna, not that it's what I ever want to hope for that we have to have, but I think the services there that are going to come out of this, and there's funds being created especially for women of color or women in poverty who don't have access to transportation, or who are being overly affected by this, that there are funds that will be able to help them get transportation and get care and put them up in hotels and do those sorts of things to be able to help women access it, even if it's going to be 1,000 miles away and not in their state. So I think the interesting thing is and I think, I'm not sure if it's Missouri who's looking at, and I have not read all the language of the law, but it sounds like if you go somewhere into a different state, when you come back to Missouri, we can prosecute you.
Yeah, I'm hearing that.
Murder.
I'm hearing that. It's which is horrible.
It's
totally absurd. And it violates every possible, protection of, they say they want states' rights. Who are they kidding? Right? They don't. They're not interested in that. They're interested in tyranny and complete, dictatorship in America.
Well, and if this was about kids, and then we would have universal pre-K. We would have, we'd have all these we'd have free lunches. We'd have all these services to help kids grow up healthy and get great educations. But if you look at the majority of states where those abortion bans are going to go into effect, that is clearly not the case by looking at the demographics of how they treat education, how they treat kids. So it's just not true.
It's last on their list. I mean, children are always last on their list, who are actually born, right?
We forget about them as soon as they're born.
I just want to remind people of what happened during the Trump administration with undocumented children, how they were ripped away from their families. The legacy is right there for us to see. Remember that Maya Angelou quote about, if somebody tells you who they are, listen, right? And we haven't been doing that We have not been doing that with the right. We have not really believed what they are. And they have this real agenda that's not at all, it's an agenda that goes against a lot of our principles and beliefs and our values, as human beings, not just progressives, but as human beings, right? We need to take this seriously, and we need to be sober about what's happening. This isn't just a case of religion, and a typical what you think of with secularism. We have a totalitarian movement that really wants to change everything about our society. And we really have to take it seriously. I mean, I can't stress that enough.
I completely agree. And I do think the hope, again, I think, is for young people who do not share those values, the majority of whom do not share those values. So we unfortunately may be with this for a while, but the reality is I think this is going to backfire for young people, especially for the Republican Party, and even more increasingly for religion.
Yeah, that seems so too. And, now that we've kind of, as we do repeatedly every time we record a show, we identify the problem, right? We've identified the problem and some of what's going on. And by the way, I think you're totally right, Joe. A lot of people are downplaying this in the sense, somebody said to me, they thought, I bet you $50 the decision doesn't even go through. And I'm going like, why would you, why would you assume that this would not happen, right? I mean, they've been trying to do this for 50 years, right?
Right. People always downplay. They downplayed what was happening with the kids at the border, completely denying what was happening.
So now that we've identified that, Kevin, we're, I guess, in a way, slacktivists, because we write and we make podcasts and all that. You have an organization that is actually making a difference. And so how can those of us who care, ourselves and our listeners, get more involved? I know you have a sign up and donation page and all that for your organization. I want to be sure that you tell us about that. But beyond this kind of passive activism, I always think about what's the best way each of us can get involved to promote secularism directly in our own communities. If I wanted to get my car right now and drive out this weekend and help somebody, how could I do it?
For us, I think there's lots of ways. And if you look at, all the organizations and the secular movements, there are multiple ways you can get involved. This week is just ending Secular Week of Action. So based on the National Day of Prayer, rather than pray and do nothing, get out there and with your hands and do stuff to help people. So there's been huge efforts, especially focused on homelessness and hunger this past week of going out and helping people. So there are lots of opportunities for people who want to do things just to be good and to help their community. But I do, if you're looking for sort of secular activism, Freedom from Religion Foundation, American Atheist, American Humanist Association and Americans United for the Separation of Church and State have great action alerts that you can go and sign up for, so you know what's happening. They focus on different things. So one's going to be national level, one's going to be state level. So you know what's happening and that you can, be educated and speak out to your representatives, which I think is crucially important for us to do. When we have lobby days, go and lobby if you want to. I think my first time walking the steps into the Capitol and going into my representative office is an extremely empowering thing to do. So when they have lobby days, and the next one I know is virtual, but if you can do it in person, the feeling of that is amazing. And you will see all the other people out there lobbying, and you will understand why it's important to be openly non-religious or secular and be out there doing it, because the religious people are strongly doing it as well. And for us, we look at really how can we activate and empower students on campuses. And so one, I think, for us, our primary vehicle is having chapters on campus, so student organizations. So if you're a faculty member and can be an advisor, or if you know some students, connect them with us. So we have a place where students can get free membership on our website. We have local chapters of the Humanist Association or FFRF who are like, hey, I want to help. We're like, we have a school just down the road. We'll send you flyers. If you can go around and just put those flyers up on campus and get us one student contact, that's typically all we need. And generally within about 2 weeks, we can have a chapter up and running. So we strike while it's hot and while the student's interested,
Nice.
but typically we just need that one student. So those are some very simple things, we also have non-student members of the SSA, so which allow us to provide free membership and resources for students. So that's obviously another great way to help with that as well.
That's fantastic. That's a great list, and we will be going over that ourselves, and obviously both familiar with most of those organizations and interacted with them in the past. I believe I interviewed a previous director of the SSA maybe about 10 years ago on my old podcast. So, but anyway, we are just very, very happy to have you and to have heard all of these great ways that we can get involved. Joe, do you have any final thoughts or questions for Kevin before we go?
I think I have one last question. And Kevin, you mentioned that you work with art and encourage art in your advocacy. And I wonder what you feel like, what's the role of art as a point of resistance and as a way to gain solidarity among students and everyone, all of us really?
Yeah, we had one of our students from Southeast Missouri State, Kayla, did actually an entire presentation on art and activism and even just as far as mental health and those sorts of things. So she did a session at one of our conferences on that. But I do think there is the expressive nature of art and the creative nature of that, I think, is extremely powerful in representation and storytelling and evoking emotion. And those, I think, are highly important things, especially for young people trying to figure themselves out and what's important to them. It's a great outlet and vehicle, but also it's the way it impacts other people. And so oftentimes art can be done and stays when a protest or something is over, and we see that, and it continues its impact and its influence. And I think, there are lots of comedians and musicians and, sculptures and things like that are coming out of the secular community. And I think, encouraging that is even more important. And we actually have one of our scholarships is specifically for students who use art as part of their activism.
Interesting.
That's fantastic to hear. And I couldn't agree more, actually, because I think art is, it's something that it's hard to put into words, just in the way that a piece of art can change a space, a room, a city. Just having it there can change the way you feel about yourself. And I think it's so important, especially to have non-religious art, because our world is so full of religious art and things that are modern, things that are inclusive, expansive, really, really important stuff.
Definitely.
All right. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for being with us today. We really enjoyed every part of this.
Thank you.
It was great being here. Enjoyed it. Yes.
All right, Joe. Well, that was a great interview.
It was.
Do you have any final thoughts or anything that particularly impressed you about that?
Well, I think we all need to think about a lot of the things that Kevin is doing, primarily, that he's living, right? He's living his life in accordance to his beliefs and his compassion. And he's doing the right thing. And he's got some pragmatic stuff that he's doing. He mentioned, like helping students with getting posters or just organizing and, reaching out, making connections, building bridges, all that stuff in a very concrete way. And that's so, hopeful, as you said earlier. It's a hopeful thing to see.
It is. And of course, you obviously have a much bigger track record of real activism than I do, because you were involved in a lot of these causes back, way back, when we were practically kids. Right. And so, it really it speaks to me, because I know that I could do more, and hopefully I will try to do some more and try to get into this organizing, because I think organizing is empowering. And I think that's one of the reasons why, I think the right they've just come out so hard against this empathy, right? And against this kind of learning, against people caring about this stuff, because they know that if people care, they're going to do something. And if they do something, some of them are going to organize. And if they organize, then, we're going to win. And because there's more of us than there are of them. And this is a minority rule situation. And I want to recap about the Supreme Court. Supreme Court has got 5 of the 6 conservative justices were appointed by presidents that were not elected by a majority. And they were confirmed by a Senate that does not accurately represent the composition of the country. You got 40 senators who represent the bulk of the U.S. population from large states. And then you've got 60 senators who represent a minority of the U.S. population who are able to block anything. So we have this minority rule. And if we're ever going to overturn it, it's going to be a hard slog. It's going to be a heavy lift. And it's something that I think people need to understand, that this is not the fact that we're losing. This is the fact that the system is rigged. It is rigged by the Constitution, not just by, current Republicans. The Constitution gives them a heavy structural advantage with the Electoral College. And we've seen, we talked about the importance at the beginning of the show of the 2000 election and the 2016 election that went the wrong way due to the Electoral College. And that we would have had, if we had a majority, if we had a popular vote majority electing our president, we would have had President Al Gore and we would have had President Hillary Clinton. We'd be living in a completely different world. So this is what I want to wrap up with today, is just the understanding that this is very much of an uphill battle. We have to see ourselves like, the rolling the rock up the hill constantly, because we are. And that's what we're doing. And it's almost like you see those descriptions of privilege that we've seen where, the woman or the person of color has to jump over all these hurdles to get the same distance as the white man gets with, and he's just freely running down the track. Well, we're in the same situation as Democrats, is that we have to jump over all these hurdles just to stay even. And that's something that we are going to have to just come to terms with. And hopefully it doesn't collapse into a situation of learned helplessness and, retrenchment on our part.
Yeah. And I think we need to build small scale, intimate institutions like Kevin is doing to reinvigorate the left and progressive, and not progressive ideology and philosophies here in this country. We can't just think about voting. We have to think about, energizing our civic life, energizing our public spaces, and our communities. Because as secular people, we don't have the tradition of church communities and all of that, which is an important, that gives a lot of organizing and emotional strength to people. We need to have our own institutions as well, and build them. And it's a long project. I mean, like Kevin was talking about, this is a long haul project. We're going to have to deal with the fact that we've lost at this point and begin to rebuild.
It's a long haul project because what a church does for people is it's a casual place where anyone can go when they feel like they're in trouble, and they can go, and it's, a lot of churches are very beautiful and there are very friendly people there, and it doesn't require a big commitment to be there. Whereas a lot of our institutions are like institutions of learning or art or things like that require you to sign up for a course of study or whatever. There's not a lot of secular casual institutions that are connected. And it's not just, by the way, sure, you can go to a meetup with your atheist or secular friends. You can go for a bike ride or a hike. There's a lot of things like that, but churches represent a sort of integrated connection from that person who's just having trouble and wants a little help all the way up onto the highest levels of politics. And we've got to build that network so that we can span that ladder, going all the way up from the struggling secular person, going all the way up to being able to control policy.
Yeah. And you know what used to do that really well? Unions.
There you go. We come full
Union
circle.
Halls, lyceums.
Yeah.
And they were wiped out, most of them.
Yeah. Well, that's because they were effective. The other side knows that. And
they went after them. First thing they did, go after unions.
Yeah.
And so we can rebuild unions. We can rebuild communities, all kinds of ways, art communities, all kinds of things. That's what we can do. And by the way, this is not hard work. This is like life affirming work. You're going to be happier and be a better person for doing it and achieve something good.
Yep.
So that's what I suggest.
I agree. And we just all need leadership. We need to be leaders. And, that's something, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. It's something that requires a commitment from us. And I think that's something that we all have to figure out how much we're willing to give to change the world.
Right.
So I will leave it there. Remember, if you like our show, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, check out our Patreon, and tell your friends to listen. New episodes post Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. We also publish new articles periodically in our journal at the radicalsecular.com. I'm Sean Prophet. Thank you for being here. And remember, wherever you are, you can be radically secular.
Radical Secular Podcast is written and produced by Christoph Defoe, Sean Prophet, and Joe Okipinti. Logo and main title designed by Tim Stetner. Post-production and original theme music by Sean Prophet. Special thanks to our support team, Lindsay Brightman, Jillian Sky Jacobs, and Lori Field Okipinti.